That's why I think on the long term, you really benefit from thinking in smaller steps and trying to understand how does a third sound, how does a fifth sound. Hi, and welcome to this video. My name is Yannis, and I want to share with you some sequencing basics, real basics for programming sequences in like some electronic music setup, especially melodic sequences. So if you have some instruments that you really like some super cool hardware synth, but maybe also just a DAW, and you know how to program sequences in a technical way, but you feel like, okay, it's so random because there are so many positions where I can draw notes and okay, there are scales and there are rhythms and somehow it's theoretically correct, but I'm just totally lacking the approach. This video should be for you because I want to give you some method on how to better understand where to place notes, also how to vary notes and what kind of notes to choose as some additional notes in terms of pitch, so for making some basic melodies. And yeah, if that sounds great for you, let's jump right into it. Let's start with a basic setup of a sequence, because you always speak about a step sequencer or a step sequence, like an 8-step sequence, 16-step sequence, 32-step sequence, or sometimes also just a 4-step sequence. And the sequence or the step amount is in relation to the tempo, because with any type of sequencer you can set a tempo in beats per minute, which is usually giving you a count in quarter notes. So also inside Ableton, if I enable the click check, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. This is our main count. And if we now play the clip and see how the time cursor moves, you can see how this relates to this 16-step sequence, because here we have 16 steps. So you can see that we have 4 steps per count. So this is important here. We can also change this to 8th notes, for example, then we would have 2 steps per count. Or even like quarter notes, 1 step per count. Most of the times though, you start with a 16th note grid by default, also with many hardware sequences, but still that's a good basic thing to understand, because otherwise you might run into some issue at a certain point where you have no idea how your step sequence actually relates to the tempo you're setting. So here we're having 103 BPM and here's our 16th note grid. For the sound, I'm using some basic drift patch, which is great because drift is available in all Ableton versions. And if you're interested in using the patch I'm using, you can download it for free. The link is down below in the description. I also added a little bit of Valhalla vintage reverb because it just sounds nicer and more pleasant for playing around with those sequencing ideas. But really, you can use any sound here. Before thinking about melody, I think it's way more important to understand some rhythm basics. So if we program quarter notes, they would be here. Or if we would have like a 4-step sequence, it would look like this. And now it will be a very static sound because we simply play quarter notes. There's no rhythmic tension because there's the same space between all those notes. And while for kick drums, if you're making techno, this is all you need to know. The rhythmic interplay comes from rhythms that are on the grid and also off the grid. So since we're counting most of the time in quarter notes, now all notes are on the grid and therefore sounding just one-dimensional because we don't have any off-the-grid positions. And maybe let's change to 8th notes. So we're in like some 8-step sequence where we only have every second note. And once you move one note to another position, you already create some more interesting rhythm because it breaks the system and it's not as static as before. Let's move another one. Or move it here. And maybe also move this note. This is actually a nice rhythm, because you have 2 beats on the beat and 2 beats off the beat. Another way you can think about this is that you have different types of free slots between the individual notes. So here you can see there's a note on the first one, and actually let's make them longer so we really fill up the whole count. We leave 1 position free, we have another note, but then we leave 2 positions free, and because of this 1 and 2 combination, we make the rhythm interesting, because by inserting like 2 free slots, we move the next notes actually to the offbeat positions and therefore create some interesting rhythm. For now, let's stick to 8th notes or some 8-step sequence and see how we can bring some more variation to the pitch, because now we're only using one note. And I suppose you're not super experienced in music theory, which is no problem at all, because Ableton gives you some scale feature where you can see what notes fit inside a certain scale. So here you can see all the notes with the purple color are part of the C major scale. And if I would change this to minor, we would have some different notes. And for now, we can actually use minor, or let's use minor. So you can basically use this as some indicator for the notes that fit and move your like one step to another pitch and just see how it works. This is still a very boring interval because the distance between one note and another note you call interval, and the higher you go, the higher the interval. So right now this is called like a second between the first and the second note of a scale. It will sound a bit more flattering to use a third, for example, because it's a larger step and it sounds a bit more charismatic, at least to my ears. And so the shorter motion you would use for a more melodic approach, but since we're only having 4 pitches for sequencing, it can sound a bit dull to, for example, only choose those 4 first pitches of a scale. It works, but in my experience it's better to, if you're only looking for the first additional note, you can use to check some higher interval like a third or maybe even a fourth. This can sound super cool. Or a fifth, which also sounds great. And of course you can use, you can change the pitch at different positions. So I think I like the third here, and we can also move the last note to the fifth, for example. And my advice is to really stick to basic intervals and simple ideas here, because as soon as you go completely free and you're like, okay, I'm just gonna randomly make notes like, oh, this is part of the scale, let's use this note and maybe this one and this one. It's a bit like playing the lottery, because actually it's better because you still have notes that fit the scale, but sometimes you hit something nice, and yeah, I mean, it can still be fun to do this sometimes, but if you're trying to really understand how intervals work, I don't recommend it, or at least I don't recommend to only do it this way. Let's actually see how this sounds. And actually it doesn't sound so bad, but still, you're just overflowing your brain with all the different pitches and you don't really have the time to digest or to feel what sound effect they actually have in relation to the root note, which is C, because we're in the C minor tonality. And that's why I think on the long term, you really benefit from thinking in smaller steps and trying to understand how does a third sound, how does a fifth sound, and to focus on that. So yeah, that's just my advice here. And what I absolutely love is using octaves, and in Ableton you have this great command, or actually shift and down control, where you just bring one note to some lower octave. Otherwise, if you have some sequencer, you simply need to transpose it by 12 semitones, or you just go from C2 to C2 depending on what you see on your sequencer. But if I move this down an octave, and actually let's make sure we see all notes, you also add some other dimension to your sequence, although this is still very simple. Now, by understanding all those basic controls, you have great tools already for creating some longer cycles of sequences, sounding more musical because you don't repeat things as often. And in Ableton, you can simply duplicate a clip. I also went back to the one-note melody because we're going to modify it in a second. Also, with any type of hardware sequencer, I think it gives you like a function where you can duplicate the sequence or simply double the sequence length, and then you have the same sequence already on the next page, so you can modify it. So we're going to duplicate the sequence and use our changes, but based on this double time, or not double time, this doubled sequence. So we can, for example, move to a E flat here, go to the G here, this is F, and for the first note of the second bar, we can maybe use the lower octave for bringing in some additional variation, and moving this again to E flat, and maybe varying this one and going to B flat, which is also a great note if you're working in some C minor scale. So let's see how this works. Actually, let's move this down a little. I don't like it so much. This is better. And you can duplicate it again. And now we already have like a 4-bar structure. And a great compositional idea is that you have, if you're thinking about 4 bars, you have some basic melodic idea in the first bar. You have the same in the second bar with a little variation like the one we just did. Then in the third bar, it's basically like in the first bar. And then you have some more climax type variation in the end of the phrase. So here we could, for example, go a bit higher in the sequence because you get a climax from going higher in pitch, often at least. And here we could use the higher C. So now we actually have like a whole range of 2 octaves for our sequence, which is quite large, but I think it really helps for making it sound more interesting, because if you only use like smaller intervals, you quickly get the idea that it sounds a bit dull. So we use other pitches here, and maybe here we go to the G, then here we use the third, and here, I don't know, maybe we can try the B flat this time. And let's see how this works, and I think we have to make it a bit smaller so we can see all notes. Okay, let's check it. I'm not super happy about the B flat here. Maybe we can move this to, why don't we just use D? Because then we have a little scale fragment, because that's what I mean. Sometimes scale fragments are great if you have longer cycles, but it sounds really dull if it's just a 4-step scale fragment. And you can continue this duplicating idea, because actually this sounds like a cool structure, but if it would come for a second time, we could maybe in the 8th bar change the sequence to something even more scale-like. Well, in the end, we just move down the whole C minor scale in full 8th notes. So actually, this wouldn't be enough. We move it here, which creates some even stronger climax. So here we're on G, then here we would have F, E flat, and D. Actually, we would need one more note. Maybe let's let's start it on the 2. Let's see how this works. I think this would sound way better in a faster tempo. By the way, in case you enjoyed this video and also feel like supporting the channel, you can quickly hit the like button, and be also known that on my website I offer additional content. So I have some online classes, I made sound and sample packs, and I also offer one-on-one coaching. So if you connect to my teaching style, be warmly invited to check it out. Links are down below in the description. Let's also check how this works with 16th notes, although it's basically the same, because instead of having some 8-step sequence, we now have some 16-step sequence, and it's related differently to the main pulse. Now we have 4 triggers per pulse, but still, if you change the tempo, you saw that you can make it work also with 8th notes. It always depends on the relationship between the step sequence, the subdivision, and the tempo. So also you can have like a quarter note sequence in tempo 400 that sounds like 16th notes, for example. But if we have the 16th note grid and start with the static quarter notes again, we have more positions to choose from, because now we have actually 3 subdivisions. And I'm going to move them a bit, just one. It's really nice to have one note that is off the grid, but based on the 16th note grid, you get different positions. This would be some 8th note position. But that's a cool start. And you can fill up notes, because you see we still have some space. And then you apply the same principles again. You choose a couple of pitches you like. For this time, let's actually use a 5th, for example. Maybe use some higher octave here. And also we can maybe use another scale. So let's use something more, actually let's use something experimental. Why not? Sometimes it's great to choose those scales that are a little more unconventional, although actually it fits. But if we use some additional notes, it's gonna be a bit more spicy. So let's use a B here. I don't know if it's too experimental for your taste. I sometimes like to use those. And here we could again go some octave lower, and already we have some very interesting range of notes. And you can also recognize the rhythmic pattern. So we have a note, then there are 2 slots free, a note, 2 slots free, a note, 1 slot free. And on a 16th note grid, I think this is some super efficient way of creating rhythms, like having the 2 and 1 combinations. And it's actually the same as you saw with the 8th notes. Because if you repeat this kind of rhythm, it usually sounds interesting, because it's like a syncopated rhythm that is used a lot in different types of music. It also works if you use it throughout the whole bar. So now we actually apply this concept, and here we just use some additional note together with the click. And you can mute notes, so it doesn't have to be like 1 or 2, but the main idea is that it's always somehow based on the idea of having 1 or 2 slots free, or actually then more of them if you mute one of those notes in between. But it's a great idea to start this way, so you can still take notes away, and then you build your rhythm. And yeah, it's just super fun to me, and really a fun process to move individual notes once you have a rhythm like this. Oh, this one is nice. This is nice. And again, you can apply the same principle of duplicating it and adding some sort of variation in the second bar. For example, why not going to the lower C again here? often it's nice to change the end. So we go even higher the second time with our other note. Maybe the other way around, that's already enough. And again, I already hear it in a 4-bar phrase where in the 4th bar we add some variation again, some sort of climax where we go a bit higher in the melody. Maybe you start with the highest C and apply the same rhythm again for this kind of climax. So we have one position where we compose a note and we leave 2 free. And then we would have this one. It's a bit complicated to see if you're so far away from the scale. Actually, it should be this one. And here, and let's see how this sounds. And somehow the first note should be a low one, I guess. And maybe we move the middle one to the C. And actually, I forgot to say, you can highlight the scale, then it's much easier. I should have told you before. But yeah, I don't know why I didn't enable this. Sometimes with the Ableton features, there's something super obvious and I just get used to not using it. And at a certain point, I'm like, oh, wow, I didn't use this for a few months, but it's just so useful. That's a good example here. But let's check the sequence once more. And still, those are basic examples, but I think it helps you to understand the relationship between notes and to start understanding how melodies work. Because if you do the random approach, just drawing notes, you will most likely not learn so much because it's always like a random approach that can be great. I love random approaches, but if you want to be a bit more conscious about what kind of notes you use, where you place them, this is great. And also, it's a great exercise to only use one sound, because if you use a big range, and sometimes you go to those low tones, you also imitate some bass. So we actually have some cool bass tones here that sound really great once they come. And we can also make it faster, then you hear them more often. But you can also consider transposing more of them to the lower octave. I think it sounds actually great. Maybe this one should be low as well. And that's where I want to leave you. I hope you enjoyed this video and it helped you to gain some basic knowledge of rhythm and melody. So now you can go to your instruments and try to apply it and make your own little sequences. Again, I really encourage you to take it slow and to focus on little things at a time, because on the long term you will benefit even more from it. But I have multiple videos on my channel about sequencing techniques. Some of them are also quite advanced. And I'm going to link you 2 videos here that you're warmly invited to watch. And apart from that, I just wish you lots of inspiration with whatever it is that you create, and really hope to see you soon again at this channel. Bye.